Well, it's a minute past, so I'd like to begin. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the virtual world. Normally I take live tours of the British Museum for LSJS, but it's not open at the moment. So welcome to our online tour of Exile Through the Ages, a virtual journey in 5 objects. So at the moment we are in the middle of the 3 weeks, posed between Shiva Asaba Tammuz and culminating in Tisha B'Av. So we're commemorating the destruction of both the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE and the second temple in 70 CE. So accompanying these terrible devastations was a whole loss of independence and the exile of the Jewish people from the land of Israel. So these exiles were not the first in our history. So this period of the 3 weeks seems an opportune moment to look at our history of exile. So to do so, I'm going to take 5 objects, treasures that can be seen in the British Museum, 1 for each of our exiles, and see what it can tell us about those exiles, and if there's anything that we can actually learn from them. So we're going to be doing a bit of time travel and geographical travel, especially as that's rather hard to do at the moment, but it will be good to leave Northwest London, even virtually. And so I want to take you as we travel back in time to before the Common Era, to the 14th century BCE, and then finish up in the 2nd century BCE. So traveling time will be 55 minutes and 12 centuries. We'll be visiting the Middle East, Egypt, and what is now Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and we'll journey chronologically through the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, Persian, and Greek empires. So buckle your seatbelts, get yourselves nice and comfy, and we'll be off. So I'm going to share screen and take you on a little journey. So here we are, we're in England. Interesting. Oh, this is very interesting. Okay, I've lost my other screen. Let me see if I can do something here. Yes, I think I can. Okay, if you just hold on 1 second. I seem to have lost my notes. Lovely. Okay, excellent. So can everybody see England, where we are, the UK at the moment? Lovely. So let's head off to the Middle East. Okay. So let's go out a little bit. And I don't think this is actually the screen. I think we want to go somewhere else. So let's see if we can get a better look at all the, yes, we'll just come out of this. Okay, now I think what we'll do is we'll actually just zoom out a bit so we can take advantage of the fact that we're in an aeroplane and we can see the whole of this region. And what you can see there is imposed on our globe. Let's go back in a little bit further so we could a bit more. There we are. Now, can everybody see all those outlines? We've got different colors here. We have got orange for the Egyptian empire. That's the extent of the Egyptian empire. There we go, orange around here. And we've got red for the Assyrian. We've got, I think it's, let's see, we've got green for the Babylonian, we've got blue for the Persian, and then the biggest you can see is black for the Greek empires. So that gives us an idea of where we are. You can see Israel, you can see Jerusalem highlighted there with its, there we go, you can see that. Highlighted there. So we get a little bit of sense of our geography because that's really important. Now, we're going to go first of all to the earliest empire, the earliest exile of all, and that's going to be the Egyptian. So let's just take a look more closely at just the Egyptian exile. Okay, now tell me, can you see that, or is it just still the same? I think it's still the same. So let's see. Let's try and get our technical stuff sorted properly. Okay. So I'm going to, oh, that's an interesting one. So tell me, if anybody's not on mute, can you see just the 5 empires, or can you see just one? You tell me what you can see.
I've not just got the Egyptian in orange.
Oh, lovely. Okay, great. You can see just the Egyptian. That's lovely. Okay, so let me just put that. And great. Okay. Lovely. So you can still see that, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can see the extent of the Egyptian empire there. And if we take, I don't think we can. And that goes up. You can see it goes across Egypt and it goes up into Israel. If I move this across, I think you'll be able to see it better. There we go. I think that might be better. Okay, so this Egyptian empire, we want to see something that was found in Egypt, in Thebes, and that was in 1817. If we go in a bit closer, you can see where Thebes is. It's identified there with the place name. And it's quite a long way down the Nile. Let's see if we can just head into Thebes and see it a bit closer, that we can see we're heading down towards that Nile region. And what can we see? Lots of desert. Yes. Okay, coronavirus temporarily closed. I wonder if you can see that. So we can't see anything in Egypt at the moment, but what we can do is head off to the British Museum and see what they found there. So we can have, there we go. We are now in the Egyptian Gallery of the British Museum. Can everybody see that? Yeah, lovely. Okay, yes. So you can see here that we have a head and we have an arm. So let's go a little bit closer and let's try and find out what this head and arm is all about. Okay, so there we go. You see, we can move virtually around this museum, which is rather wonderful. We're actually in the gallery now of the British Museum. So who is this head and arm? Well, it was a broken statue, and it was found by archaeologist Giovanni Battista Belzoni. I love that name. Anyway, archaeology was not quite then what it is now, and so we're not quite sure whether he found both pieces together. We know he found the head in the temple of Mut at Karnak. That's in Upper Egypt, and we're presuming that he found the arm in the same place. They're both made out of red granite, and the actual statue itself was 30 foot tall. It's a massive, massive statue. Anyway, as I say, the transport was very, very difficult at the time, and just to sort of give you an idea, they're trying to bring it back to Britain, or England, which actually took an awful long time. But it actually took 8 days just to move these pieces 1 mile. This is the sort of conditions that they were having to deal with at the time. Okay, so that's a little bit about where this statue was found. What about our history in Egypt? We're quite familiar with our Egyptian exile because it's commemorated in Pesach. We know how we came to Egypt with Yaakov and his sons, and eventually became slaves to Pharaoh for 400 or 210 years. And we left around the 13th century. The exact dating is actually quite difficult, but it's likely that this king, who we believe was Amenhotep III, and he dates to the 14th century, would have been one of the pharaohs ruling at the time that the Jews themselves were in Egypt. So, Bnei Israel being in Egypt, we might be able to actually learn something about our exile there, or certainly about the Egyptian culture from this statue. So let's look a bit closer at our statue. And okay, this is the British Museum. Let's have a look. There we go. Can you see this quite closely? Yeah. Okay, so what you can see here is I'm focusing on his arm. So the arm itself is really, really huge. And you can see that the hand is clasped, and broken off on the edge of the hand is actually something that we don't see anymore. And we know that it's actually documents. There were documents in this hand. So what was the relevance of these documents? And the relevance is that the documents in ancient Egypt's culture denoted authority. That the pharaoh of the time had the authority to rule, to be pharaoh, because of these documents. Now, this is quite interesting, because we have scattered throughout our throughout Shemot and the Haggadah, when we read about the Egyptian exile.
Can you ask everyone to mute themselves?
Shall I can mute. Sorry, is there? Okay, let me find. I'm just going to stop share for a sec, and I'm going to mute everybody. Okay, so I have done that. Okay. Okay, there we go. So let's go back to our and let's see. Okay. Yes, so it's denoting authority. So what do we have? What image do we have throughout of Shemot? We actually have the image of the Yad Chazaka Uzrona Tuya, a strong arm and an outstretched hand, a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And this resonates throughout Shemot, throughout the Haggadah, continually. It's maybe it's a coincidence that we have this same image that is so important for the Egyptians to denote the authority of the Pharaoh, but yet we have it that's denoting the authority of Hashem. Or maybe something else is going on. Maybe the Torah has purposely taken an image that would have resonated so much for the Egyptians, and also for the Jews who had lived so long amongst the Egyptians, that would have understood this terminology and this cultural references. And what it was actually saying to the Jews themselves was, now we know who the real authority is. The person who doesn't, or the entity, God, who actually doesn't need documents in his hand to give him the authority. It's Hashem himself who, with the Yad Chazaka Zerah Natuyah, can take the people out of Egypt. And this is the lesson that the Israelites were learning. This is what Hashem was trying to teach them, not just through the 10 plagues and the miracles of being taken out of Egypt, but also throughout the whole of their time in the Midbar. This is what the 40 years was to tell them, so that they could understand where authority was coming from, where they needed to get their instructions, and to keep the mitzvot. So this is just something very, very important just this slight reference just can give us this understanding so much better of the Egyptian culture. So now I am missing something here. So let me see how this is, no, this is going to work there. I'm trying to get some, this is quite interesting. Now, I'm not quite sure how to do this because I must say this is the first time I've taken you on, taken a virtual journey. So if you just bear with me for this technical issue just for 1 minute. I'm going to, yes, we can then move to our next object. So sorry, if you just hold on 1 second, and then I'm just going to see what's going on here. Lovely. Okay. Okay. Now, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our next exile. So Egypt is our first exile. So what is our next exile? That was the Assyrian. Let's go back. Let's stop share. So that is our Assyrian exile. Now, that was actually 500 years later. So what had happened from the Egyptian times, which was the 13th century BCE, to the Assyrian time, which was, we're talking about the 8th century. Well, we know that they wandered in the Midbar. Yehoshua finally took them into the land of Canaan, settled them in their tribal portions. They were then judged by the Shoftim, and then asked for a king. People asked for a king. So after the kings Shaul, David, and Shlomo, which actually shows the height of the monarchy, the kingdom was split between King Shlomo's son, that's Rechavam, and his challenger, Yeroboam. So what we actually had was a split kingdom. So now you had 2 kingdoms side by side in the, let's go and let's have a look at this split kingdom. And there we go. And you can see that you've got the northern kingdom of Israel, and that's in the blue, and the southern kingdom of Yehuda, and that's in the orange, just below. This is actually a particularly good map because you've got all the enemies of Israel. When I'm saying Israel there, I'm talking about both kingdoms. You can see all the enemies of the kingdoms all around. And in the north, you can see Aram, the kingdom of Aram, Damascus, and above that, Assyria. So as Aram's power waned, Assyria's grew. And it's to the Assyrian power that Bnei Israel was they were looking up and fearing, because they're fearing what's going to happen. So what they do is, how they respond to that fear is sometimes they're making alliances, they're playing off Egypt against Assyria, sometimes they pay their taxes and tributes, but most often what they're doing is disobeying the advice of their prophets, in particular Yeshayahu, and they find themselves drawn into the idolatry and practices of the Assyrians. This is particularly true of the northern kingdom. Most of us have heard of the 10 lost tribes. Well, it was the Assyrians who conquered them, but how were they lost? So let's have a look at the Assyrian Empire. This much larger than the Egyptian Empire, you can see. So you can see that in the north, you've got Nineveh. That's the capital city, and so it's very important. It's partly today where Mosul is. So part of Mosul encompasses Nineveh. So the ever-expanding Assyrian Empire was looking south and west. And what's south and west? Well, that's Israel. And they were disobedient. The Israelites are disobedient. They stopped paying their tribute, and they were conspiring with their enemies against Assyria. And so the Assyrians began attacking the cities in the north of Israel. the northern kingdom, and finally conquered them. Eventually, in 722, so this is how we've got now to the 8th century, the Assyrians completed the conquest of the Israelite northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom consisted of 10 of the 12 tribes. And so this was the fate of the 10 tribes, lost and exiled to cities in Assyria and replaced, because the Assyrian tradition was to take conquered peoples and transfer the populations. So different populations from all around Assyria came into Israel, northern Israel, and the Israelites were exiled to Assyria. Now the 10 lost tribes were lost and completely disappeared from history. Now, although we hear nowadays of the reappearance of some of those purporting to be one of the 10 lost tribes, we are never sure. So my second object will show how the Assyrians, not here, so let's go into the museum again and let's have a look at the next objects. It's going to show us exactly how these tribes, how the tribes were lost. Okay, so I don't think this. Okay, so we need to try and get to Assyria. And seems to be taking a little bit of time. There we are. Now, if you could just nod, can you see yourself in the museum now? No, not in the museum. Okay. So let's go back to screen share. Let's take this up, because I definitely want to take you into the museum. So let's try, there we go. How's that? Can you see that now? Are we in the museum? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, so you can see all around here, we're right in the museum. Let's go to the end and look right back at the room. This is the Lachish room. So we're now in the Assyrian room in the British Museum, and you can see the wall relief all the way around. This is from the palace in Nineveh, and you can see, you know, how vast it is. There's more parts of it all over the place. But if we hone in, we can get in a little bit closer, and we can see the actual tactics that the Assyrians used, and this is how they conquered the northern kingdoms. You can see their advanced weaponry. They've actually got they've got spears, and they've got bows and arrows. They've got shields. But look here, if we walk down a little bit further, come back. Can you see this here? You can see their pointy helmets. Can you see the pointy helmets here? This is very typical of the Assyrians. But you've also got like a siege engine. Can you see the siege engine here? Yes, and it's kind of like got a battering ram with a point. So this siege engine is battling the Israelite city. This is Lachish. So Lachish is just southeast of Jerusalem, and so it's one of the cities that was taken, even though it was taken a bit later than 20 years later than the Northern Kingdom. It shows us exactly the sort of tactics that the Assyrians used. So you can see here the one of the gates or the towers surrounding the city. You can see the people up here trying with bows and arrows to shoot against the Assyrians, but all is lost. And you can see the people having to come out here. They're coming out in exile. Okay, they're going to be taken into exile. Let's put a bit of a spotlight cursor on. Can you see here all these people? And if we go along, in fact, we can see some of the people here. They've actually been hanged. And further along, it's even more nasty. You can see people actually being flayed alive. But here, you can see here, let's move along, let's walk along a bit. And let's turn back. There, can you see the people are being flayed alive? But you can actually see Jewish people here all going into slavery, or, well, not slavery, but all going into exile. So you can see the little people are children, they've got their animals. You see also their distinctive headdresses. These are distinctive of the Jews. If you look at some of these wall reliefs, all the people have different head dresses on, they have different outfits on, distinctive of the different peoples. You've got all the peoples going into exile. So where was this wall relief? The wall relief is actually found in the palace of the king of Assyria who conquered Lachish, and that was Sanherib. So Sanherib comes up, he's actually mentioned in Tenach, but we can actually see from his palace in Nineveh exactly what would have happened, certainly what happened to Lachish and what would have happened to the northern kingdom. So we've seen the Egyptian and the Assyrian exiles. Our next exile could have been a repeat performance of the total disappearance of the Jews under the Assyrians when we were exiled to Babylon, but as we shall see, it had actually a very different outcome. So the Babylonian Empire is our third empire. Let's have a look at the, let's have a look at the extent of that. Okay. And let's go, there we go. We can see the Babylonian Empire here. So they conquered the Assyrians and they took over their empire. They were responsible for the destruction of the first temple as they swept into the remaining southern kingdom of Judah, finally conquering the besieged Jerusalem in 586 BCE. So that's the 6th century, and taking away the king. So from then on, we don't have a Jewish monarchy. We have no homeland, and despairing people taken in exile to Babylon, mourning as we went. So this is exactly what we are remembering and commemorating at the moment, particularly on Tisha B'Av. And it's commemorated, it's mourned in Tehillim, Al Narot Bavel, Sham Yashavnu, Gam Bachinu, Bezachrenu et Sion. So by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. The king who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit HaMikdash, was King Nebuchadnezzar. And we actually have in the museum a relief from his palace of Nebuchadnezzar. This is one of the reliefs. This is one of the lions that lined the hall that you had to walk down before you even got to the gate of King Nebuchadnezzar's palace. You can see it's very different from the Assyrian palace, but it was also created to inspire fear, because the way that these lions were positioned was you'd be walking towards them, and what you'd see as you came across them would be their snarling mouths. That would be, you know, your first sight of these lions, and there'd be rows and rows of lions. It was absolutely huge. I'll show you how big the actual gate was. There we go. This is in Berlin. This is in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Absolutely vast. It's like sort of like 3 stories high. You can see by the people how high it was. So, so we were exiled to Bavel. So all the people that came out of Jerusalem, out of the southern kingdom, were exiled to Bavel. what did we learn there? Well, we learned something quite different from our Assyrian experience, which resulted in the complete disappearance. One of the differences is that we had the prophet Yirmiyahu that we were actually listening to guide us and direct the Jewish people of Bavel, even though he wasn't actually with them. He wrote to them, and let's see his letter to them. So this is in Yirmiyahu, it's chapter 29, and he writes to the exiles in Bavel, and he explains to them how, even though they are mourning, even though they've lost their country, they've lost their monarchy, that what they need to do is build. They need to build houses for themselves, they need to plant gardens, eat their produce, they need to live, they need to continue, and they need to create a new infrastructure in this foreign land. In particular, he says, and you can see this in verse 7, seek the peace of the city where I have exiled you. This is in Hashem's words, and pray for it to the Lord, for in its peace you shall have peace. This is Yirmiyahu's message from Hashem to the exiles. What they have to do is pray for the good of the country that they've been exiled to. And of course, this is actually the source of the prayer for the royal family that we say now each week in Shul. So Yirmiyahu, in many different ways, teaches us how to live in exile. So in a way, this is a terrible destruction, but it's a successful exile because it's the blueprint for how we will continue to live whenever we find ourselves in exile. So, although there are no more Jewish kings, it's not long before the Babylonian Empire itself is conquered by the next empire. So within that next empire, the second temple is rebuilt. This is 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. And the new rulers, the Persian Empire, marks our next exile. So we've had the Egyptian exile that took us out into the land of Egypt, and then, into the land of Israel. And then from Israel, we were first exiled to the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. Bavel took the rest of the country, so therefore there is hardly anybody left in Israel. And then the Persians took over the Babylonians. The Babylonians actually were not governing over Israel for very long at all. Now, the Persian Empire was a vast empire. You can see it here, outlined in blue. It extends from Hodu ad Kush, as we're told in the Megillah. And of course, it is the background to Purim that we see in the Persian Empire. So let's look at our fourth object that comes from the Persian Empire, and that's the Cyrus cylinder. It was discovered in 1879, and it's sometimes billed as the first, or the ancient charter of human rights. It might not be quite that, but it certainly gives us a taste of the type of empire that Koresh, Cyrus the Great, who gave this cylinder to the Babylonian people when he conquered them. And this is where the cylinder was actually found, in Babylon. And he conquered them in 539 BCE. Now, what is interesting is, although he'd taken over their city, Koresh was showing them that his was a very different empire than any previous one. And we can see what he says in this cylinder. We've got some of the quote here. I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king. Why is he called the great king? Because, of course, he's the king of kings. He's the emperor, the king who's taken over all these different countries, all these different nations. The powerful king, the king of Bavel, and he goes through all the different nations and cities that he has conquered. And then he continues, I also gathered all their people and I returned them to their habitations. So what Koresh was saying was that all the people that he'd conquered for the first time, they were allowed to go back to the cities that they had come from. The cities were states, the city-states, the states, the nations that they had come from. And this was completely different to anything that had happened before. So he conquered Bavel, and all the people that had been taken by Bavel to Babylon, out of their countries like Jerusalem. So all the Israelites that had been taken out of Yehudah, the southern kingdom of Yehudah, were now allowed to go back. Furthermore, he says, I resettled all the gods. So with all these city-states that he conquered, he actually takes the idols out, because the understanding then was if the idols are taken out of a city, then the idols no longer have power. So if the idols don't have power, then the people don't have power. So not only were the peoples allowed to go back to their cities, but their idols were allowed to go with them. And that meant for the Jews that we could rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, which we started doing under Koresh. So this is a very different kind of empire than we've had before. And this is actually the background for the Purim story, which takes place in Susa. Let's have a look. We can see, oh, we can't see Susa. Let me show you where Susa is on this map. Let's see, over here. It's down here. Okay, if you can see that. That's where Susa. Susa is Shushan. And Cyrus' declaration is almost identical to the one in the book of Ezra. And it marks the period of Shivat Zion, return to Israel. So the Persian Empire is really known for what we might call today religious tolerance. It's not trying to impose the Persian beliefs on the conquered peoples. And perhaps this is the key to understanding the Purim story, a time where Esther is known by her Persian name. Okay. Let's go back. I'm trying to go back to the, we can't, there we go. We can go back to the Cyrus cylinder. So this is a time, the Cyrus cylinder is sort of indicating that sort of atmosphere, that cultural understanding, a time where Esther is known by her Persian name. Of course, Purim is taking place 100 or so years after this, but it's sort of giving us an idea of the sort of cultural climate. So Esther is known by her Persian name. She's not known by her Hebrew name, Hadassah. And Purim, the Megillah itself, is a story that without the name of God in the whole of the Megillah, it's a story that doesn't have the obvious hand of Hashem in our lives. Rabbi Liebtag of Yeshivat Har Etzion writes that this is the implicit criticism of the book of Esther, that the Jews were too assimilated at the time, and this resulted in their near destruction. So it's reflected in the earlier declarations of the Cyrus cylinder. Cyrus's message could have resulted in mass immigration to Israel, as the Jews were free to return, but yet they didn't. So years after Koresh, when King Ahasuerus takes the Persian throne, the Jews have ignored the call to go back to Jerusalem. Again, Hashem saves them, and this time from the evil hands of Haman. But maybe what the Megillah is really asking is, how safe are we in a foreign society? We think we might be. We think we can get by in this sort of involving ourselves in the machinations of a foreign court or government. But how safe are we really? So that's the sort of atmosphere of the Persian Empire. We've had 4 exiles so far. We've had the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and the Persian. And so now where? Who conquers the Persians? Who is our 5th exile? Well, finally it was the Greeks. And I say finally because they did have lots of wars with the Persians where they were trying to conquer them. They were over many years, there were many wars, the Greco-Persian wars. But finally, under Alexander the Great, they conquered the Persians in 333 BCE. So we can see Alexander the Great's empire, huge, and stretching from Greece in the west all the way to, well, where we'd say kind of like Afghanistan and India in the east. Now, originally, Alexander the Great had actually a good relationship. The early Greek Empire had a good relationship with the Jews, and they didn't interfere too much with them. But this changed when Antiochus Epiphanes, that's Antiochus IV, in the first quarter of the 2nd century, until his reign, and then he started making decrees against the Jews, including banning Brit Milah. He defiles the temple, and it's he who sets up the idols in it. So this is the introduction to the Hanukkah story, set against the backdrop of the Greek Empire. The Maccabean rebellion begins, as we know, in the village of Modi'in, but it was not just a straightforward war against the Greeks. It was actually more complex than that. The real war of Hanukkah was a religious war of the religious, fervent Jews, the Jews who were keeping to mitzvot and Torah, against the Hellenized brethren, the Jews who actually were looking towards the Greeks and trying to become more Greek than the Greeks. They're the ones who are called Hellenized. In fact, if you look up Hellenization or Hellenism in the dictionary, they'll say it's non-Greeks who were trying to be Greek, particularly the Jews. The Jews were particularly fervent about the Greek civilization. The Hellenized Jews were looking to the Greeks and admiring and aping. They were actually adopting the culture and the customs of the Greeks, and actually giving up their Judaism for that. So my 5th object, which for me represents the lure and the beauty of Greek civilization, shows us this Greek pot. And I think it sort of, it helps us understand the difficulty that faced the Jews at this time. So when you go to the museum, you see, like all these amazing pots. This particular one, you see, it's actually called black figure pottery. The images on it are done in a sort of black slip, and the details are then picked out in a sort of pick to give fine details, and then it's baked in a kiln. It depicts the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, which actually results in the Trojan Wars. But a bit more about that in a minute. You can see from this pot how beautiful it is, and if we compare it to Israelite pottery at the time, there we go, Israelite pottery, which is much plainer, simple. Obviously, we wouldn't have images of people on it. But you can see the contrast, and for me, that contrast really epitomizes the difficulty that some Jews were having looking towards this beautiful Greek civilization with all that it offered in terms of the latest beauty, the latest pot making, democracy, the beauty of the arena, and worshipping the beauty of the body. But not only that, there were some aspects of Greek civilization that weren't necessarily an antithesis to Jewish values either. Both Greek and Jews valued scholarship, valued wisdom profoundly. But there were obviously differences. This pot, as I said, shows the marriage, and it shows that within this marriage, the ceremony that took place, the gods were actually quarreling. And this is another thing. The Greeks had so many different gods, a complete antithesis to the Jewish worship of one God. And these gods, the way they behaved, they were full of bad behavior, quarreling like they do in this story. So the Greek gods are quarreling and they throw down a golden ball. And this actually starts the Trojan Wars, which or the mythical wars, which last for 10 years. But this is part of the culture that the Greeks, the Greeks symbolized. And again, this is the opposite to Jewish values of goodness and morality. The Greek gods, apart from the fact that there were so many of them, were seemed to epitomize the worst qualities of humankind, that they were certainly no better and in many cases much worse than humans themselves. So the Greeks, however, were even though they could see that there were some aspects of Judaism which they would agree with, like scholarship, they were actually horrified by various aspects of Jewish worship. So the idea of a Brit Milah that would desecrate the human form would really horrify them. So this pot for me symbolizes the beauty of the Greek civilization and the worship of beauty. I suppose it's the Greek belief system that is summed up in the quote on here by John Keats. Incidentally, when he wrote it, when these Greek pots started arriving in the British Museum, particularly the Parthenon, this is when he wrote his poem, Ode to a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth, he says in it, and truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know on earth, and all you need to know. Well, it's not all. Certainly not in morality and the ideals of goodness and kindness. Now, this was a different exile to the other ones that we've seen. It didn't send the Jews outside Israel, or the Greeks didn't. So I call it an exile because it sent the Hellenized Jews away from Judaism. And it was also the Greek Empire that was later taken over by the Romans, who carried on so many of the traditions and culture of the Greeks, and later in 70 CE destroyed the second Beit HaMikdash, resulting in our final dispersal and exile. So the lessons that the Greek exile give us continue to resonate. How to live in a civilization with different values to our own Jewish ones. How to strike the balance between appreciating the beauty and wisdom of Western civilization, but without losing our identity and important Jewish values, even when we're living in our diaspora communities. So, sort of to sum up, these 5 objects from the British Museum tell us a lot more about our Jewish story. They tell us, these exiles tell us, they give us our history, our ancient history from, okay, we've gone from the 15th century BCE all the way through to the 1st century, actually the 1st century CE. So we can look at it as an arm, a wall relief, a lion, a cylinder, and a pot, or Egypt, Assyria, Babel, Persia, and Greece, and so much more that we can learn. 5 exiles. But even though we were exiles, we the Jews are still here. We still remain. We can actually go to the museum. We can go to the Middle East. We can go all over the place where these empires were. We can go and we can come back. But where are their vast empires? So perhaps these exiles teach us something, each and of themselves. Egypt, the first of our exile. We appreciate anew the expressions that are used in Tenach, in Torah. They have cultural connections from many centuries ago, And by looking at the museum, by understanding the objects in the museum, we understand those cultural resonances. So an outstretched arm for us now can resonate much deeper. So from the Syrian exile, what do we learn? Well, we're left with a severe warning. This was terrible. The Jews of the Northern Kingdom disappeared. From the Babylonians, we learn how to live in exile. We learn to build institutions, to continue our society, and also to look for the peace of our host countries. In Persia, in the Persian exile, we learn how to live in a secular world with no obvious signs of Hashem, where we are reliant on the ruling authority of the non-Jewish world, the court world, or the government, and how to get along within those worlds. From the Greek exile, we learn again that how important it is to know how to live in the non-Jewish world, and the importance of understanding that sometimes cultures do clash. We need to live with their institutions, appreciate their wisdom, their learning, where it's appropriate. So how do we take the things of beauty, enjoyment, and learn from them without contradicting or counteracting the words and the values of Torah? So we can learn from each of those exiles and seek comfort from the promise of Hashem that we hear in the words of Yirmiyahu, and the hope that concludes, that comes out from the Haftarah that we have on the first of the 3 weeks. And that's in the words of Yirmiyahu, Kol ma Hashem, Zacharti lach chesed ne'orayich, ahavat klulotayich, lechtech acharai b'midbar. These are words very familiar to us, be'eretz lo zru'ah. Thus says Hashem, I remember for the sake of the kindness of your youth, the love of your bridal days, your following after me in the wilderness, in a land not sown. Hashem will remember what we did all those years after our first exile, and he will remember us for the good and look after us. So let us take this promise from Hashem to remember us, to sustain us now in the mourning of the 3 weeks. And let us hope that this is the last 3 weeks that we have to mourn and commemorate these exiles, and hopefully the last Tisha B'Av that we ever need to fast. Thank you. So I will stop share now, and we have a few, let's see, we've got a few more minutes, 5 minutes, so if there's any questions. So somebody's asked, after Alexander's death, yes, at Shifra, didn't the Alexander the Great's empire split into 3? Yes, it did. You actually had, well, 2 main, it was actually 3, but the 2 main ones were the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And Antiochus Epiphanes of our Hanukkah story was the Seleucids. So yes, it definitely did. I wanted to just show that vast Greek empire. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a live question. Okay, as you can see behind me.
Yeah, I'm going to just say, I'm not going to ask anything. I'm just going to say that was absolutely fabulous. Really beautifully presented, beautifully done, and thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Okay, I can see Sean clapping. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sean and Gerard.
Sean and Gerard. Okay, I can see the last part.
It's a lovely
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Michelle. That was
brilliant.
interesting.
Very interesting.
Thank you so much. So
Okay.
The museum.
Thank you, Shula. Okay, hopefully you feel a bit transported, because I think we need a little bit of that now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
very much.
Okay, so copy of the slides. Yes, Yehuda, if you would like to put your, I don't know who you are, but if you would like to put your email in the chat, then I can send you the slides.
Thank you for a lovely journey.
Mm.
It was a
Thank
good
you,
trip.
Ruth.
Really nice. And very interesting.
Has this been
Michelle?
recorded? Yes, it has. Yes?
Michelle, it was amazing. Absolutely brilliant.
Oh, is that Julie?
Brilliant,
Hi,
brilliant.
Julie. You're
Yeah,
looking very
hi,
dark.
sorry. Yeah, because, I don't know, I'm at my sister. That was
Oh,
amazing. It really helped me as well with my Nach as well. Like,
Okay. I started doing it. I started doing it today. I need to ask you some questions about it.
okay, we'll speak tomorrow. That was
Okay.
amazing. Well done. Well
Okay.
done. I bet that took hours. Well done.
Neil, please. Thank you. Belinda, yes. Belinda, I think I've got your email. Just pop it in the chat, please. And then I could. Okay. Okay. Lovely. One new message. Fine. Okay, I will save the chat. Can I? I think I can save the chat, can't I?
Michelle, thank you. Really, really interesting. And it was great to see the way that you got through the museum. Really clever.
Yeah, it's nice just to see something move a little bit. So, you know, I mean, it's amazing you can do this on Google Earth. So it really does make it come alive a bit. Though, I must say, some of it, I didn't realize that I couldn't see my notes at the same time. I was so happy with my notes, but I couldn't, there was some part of it I couldn't see it, but anyway.
That's a bit scary.
Yeah, well, I just printed them, then Aubrey came in with them. So
Oh,
that's where I disappeared to in the middle. So I just rushed off to try and get them.
Well, you're very good. You're very calm. And it was really, very, very, it was really fun. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very much.
Okay.
Amazing.
So let's. I'm sure there was somewhere that I could save chat. Oh, there it is. Save chat. Okay, bye-bye.